This week we're looking at the social insurance programming for the American social welfare system, and primarily this chapter deals with Social Security, unemployment insurance, workers' compensation, and Medicare programs. The other programs that we're going to be mentioning are actually covered in the next chapter on public assistance. Now, social insurance programming has a difference in that individuals who are beneficiaries who receive these benefits have paid into the system mostly while they've been working, and so this is why many people consider this to be an entitlement program. And it's interesting when Congress talks about entitlement programs. I think most of the public thinks they're talking about welfare payments, but indeed, many of the congressmen are talking about Social Security and Medicare and those kinds of programs that the American worker has come to see as their right to have access to. And so it's just kind of an interesting play on words when your representatives begin to talk about entitlements. It's worth finding out exactly what programs they're talking about, because these are really truly the entitlement programs in our system. Social insurance, the system of social insurance requires that we insure ourselves against the possibility of being poor, indigence, that is, resulting from our retirement or our loss of a job, unexpected or involuntary, the death of a family breadwinner, or because of disability. These programs are funded through payroll deductions and other kinds of taxes that we have throughout our lives. And the intention is to help the beneficiaries to maintain their income through at least partial replacement of lost earnings. None of these programs fully replace earnings that an individual had made prior to the period of retirement or disability, but really focus upon partial replacement of earnings. This is a pay-as-you-go system. I think somehow that's a little misleading. Um, but a pay-as-you-go system here says that current workers and employers pay for those who have already retired, are ill, or who have lost their jobs. So when you're paying your Social Security taxes, the American worker thinks this is going into a trust for me, and I'm going to get that money back when I retire. Well, first of all, you're only going to get a certain percentage of what you've paid in. You may actually today's workers may not actually recover all that they put into it, but I'm not even sure that past workers get everything they've paid into it. But the money you're putting into Social Security, or that the worker presently is putting into Social Security, is not going into an account for them to draw upon later. It is used to determine their benefits later, but the benefits that they draw later on comes from money put in that system by the workers working then as well. And so, in that respect, it redistributes income from those who are working to those who are in need of working, who are no longer in the labor market. So, in that sense, it's kind of like public assistance, but it's you don't say that to many retirees and get away with it, because, well, it all goes back to the American idea of the morality of work and the importance of work and independence and that kind of thing. And so the system kind of the way the system is designed kind of tapped into that notion that we're taking care of ourselves through Social Security taxes, when in fact our Social Security taxes today are taking care of people who are already retired today. Now, unlike public assistance, this program is not based on need. It's not means tested. The benefits are, as it says here, universal, in that people get the benefits as entitlements because they paid into the system, regardless of how much money they have otherwise. Um, there is an exception to that, which we'll touch on a little bit later, however. Beneficiaries make contributions into the system before they claim benefits, and generally then these programs are not stigmatized because the benefits are linked to those years of productive work. The fact is, these programs, although public welfare programs are the ones that get all the negative attention from our conservative leadership and from sometimes from the press and that kind of thing. Really, these social insurance programs consume many more times resources than our public assistance programs do. By the time that World War One came around, nearly all the European systems had some form of old age assistance programs in place. We really didn't have any such thing for retirees prior to that time anywhere in the world. I think it says that Germany, von Bismarck was the first leader to establish that, and he did that in order to kind of hedge against the growing trend of socialism and the attractiveness of socialism. Everybody taking care of each other. It was spreading all around Europe at that time. As you remember, I've mentioned this several times. It was a real seminal period, I think, in terms of the development of social welfare programming and the social work profession. That socialism. Becoming popular in Europe, the Bolsheviks overthrew the Tsar in 1917, which was, during World War One, or as World War One was, well, while it was going on, and so there's a lot of concern about supposedly democratic systems continuing to be popular enough, and so these systems, including our own, began to implement programs that kind of hedged against being left on your own when you got older or when you were out of work or disabled. If you ever read The Jungle by Upton Sinclair, the trials and tribulations that Jurgis went through is an example of an economic system where there are no programs in place for the elderly, no programs in place for the disabled or those who are unemployed of any kind. So, in 1920, though, the United States government instituted a federal employees retirement program. So that was really the first retirement program. This was for federal employees specifically, the first retirement program in the United States. By 1931, 17 of the states had enacted some form of old age assistance programs, although the requirements for being in that program and the amount of benefits very stringent and kind of harsh in many respects. Then the Great Depression happens, and the story there, we talked about this also, and I believe when we covered Chapter 2, the Franklin Roosevelt administration was elected in 1932 in the depths of the Great Depression, and advocated for government assistance programs for unemployed and retired workers, and after many different ups and downs based upon court rulings and those kinds of things, the New Deal was implemented, and a part of the New Deal was the Social Security Act in 1935 being passed by Congress and was signed into law that, according to our authors, established the modern American welfare state. Originally, the Social Security Act focused upon the elderly poor, dependent children, the blind, and some disabled children. And the original Act has since been repeatedly modified, and generally with each modification it's increased coverage. So now we went through the specifics of what was involved in the New Deal, and more specifically the different parts of the Social Security Act in going over Chapter 2, I believe it was, when we talked about the history of social welfare. But here we're just looking a little bit more closely at the social insurance programs in the United States that really kind of came to being under the Social Security Act or grew out of the programs and out of the philosophy based upon the Social Security Act. So actually, as I look here, well, Medicare and Medicaid really did not have anything to do with the Social Security Act, and so this slide's a little inaccurate, but anyway, we'll get to that in a second. The Social Security Act started out as old age and survivors insurance, and actually it was old age insurance. It was a retirement benefit originally in the 1935 Act, and then survivors of retirees who were eligible for benefits and their dependents of insured workers were added in 1939 to the benefits. Then in 1950s, farmers and the self-employed were added. Now, a self-employed person not only pays the employee tax, but also pays the employer tax as well. Although I think that part of the employer tax, at least, I don't know under the current tax reforms if it's still true or not, but previously at least, when the employer tax, that part that you paid was forgiven in your income tax, if I remember correctly. But in any event, farmers and self-employed were added in 1950, and I think that's where the text says about 90% of American workers then fell under the Social Security Act. Many state governments were not under Social Security originally, and I think voluntarily added or volunteered to be on it. The Alaska system, state employees do not pay into the Social Security system. You have their own separate retirement program. That's not talking about the pension, but their own retirement savings program. It's called the Supplemental Benefit System that replaces the Social Security Act. Alaska workers still put the same amount of money aside, Alaska state employees, I should say, and this is true actually for university employees as well. Still put the same amount of money aside. The employers still contribute the same amount, but instead of going into Social Security, it goes into their own sort of trust or whatever. Disability insurance was added in 1956. So when you hear about Social Security disability, that became a possibility in 1956. And it's notoriously difficult to qualify for, but you do qualify for it. And then another big change occurred in 1977 when Congress added automatic cost of living increases, and that's really kind of one of the few retirement programs that exist that have this automatic indexing for the increases in cost of living. So that's an important factor here. It's one of the things that's helped to keep the elderly out of poverty since that time, among other things. So old age insurance became old age survivors and disability insurance. And sometimes if you still get pay stubs, you'll see a deduction for OASDI, and there you see what that stands for. Unemployment insurance is also something that was enacted under the New Deal and is jointly sponsored by the federal and state governments. Supplemental Security Income, SSI. Now, this is interesting because one of the portions of the Social Security Act was federal categorical assistance to the states, as I recall, is what we said. And that means that the feds gave money to the states for certain types of categories of individuals that needed it, and that was the aged, blind, and disabled. Now, this would cover those individuals who did not work and pay into the Social Security system, and originally, of course, nobody had paid into it originally, but so those elderly people or the blind or the aged or the disabled who could not work, thus would never pay into the Social Security system, was covered under this categorical assistance originally. Every state, because it was the feds gave the money to the states, every state could administer whatever benefit level they deemed necessary or appropriate for their population of each. And so if you were an older individual who had not paid into the Social Security system and depended upon a state assistance in, say, Alabama, you can be sure you got quite a bit less than if you lived in, say, New York. And so many states were paying benefits that still had the aged, blind, and disabled well under poverty levels. And so the federal government implemented this supplemental SSI payment to make up for that difference to a certain extent to these individuals in the states that's where the supplemental piece comes in, where these states weren't paying benefit levels that were sufficient to keep people out of, even at a minimal level of poverty. Well, ultimately, and I think this occurred in 1977, might have been before then actually, but somewhere in the 70s, the federal assistance to aged, blind, and disabled that program became federalized and became the Supplemental Security Income Program, SSI. Now you hear a lot about SSI, and so if today somebody becomes disabled before they have paid into the Social Security system for a sufficient number of years, then they can't qualify for disability under Social Security, but they may qualify under the SSI program. So this program is still there for those individuals who haven't participated long enough in the labor market in order to qualify for Social Security. In order to qualify for Social Security benefits, SSA benefits, you have to work 40 quarters. That is essentially 10 years, 40 quarters with what they call, I think, a substantial earnings. And Social Security identifies the amount of money that you have to earn each quarter or each year in order to qualify, have that quarter or year qualified as being eligible. And so you have to earn sufficient income over 40 quarters, and then you're eligible for benefits under the SSA program. However, if, for instance, such as myself, where when I began to work for the state of Alaska, I worked for 20 years in the Social Security system. And then when I went to work for the state of Alaska, I was no longer in the Social Security system. And I think it's after 5 years, when you're not paying into the Social Security, you then become ineligible for Social Security disability benefits. So I had to get my own disability insurance policy or whatever set up so that I was covered in case something terrible happened. Now, although the SSI program grows out of programs that were a part of the Social Security Act, we're not talking about SSI in this chapter because it's really not a part of how our authors describe as a social insurance program, because it is needs based. And so more about that later on, but that's not one of the social insurance programs we're going to talk about according to our author's definition. Another one that is not a part of social insurance programming, again, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, but was still something that grew out of the Social Security Act, was temporary assistance. It's now called Temporary Assistance to Needy Families, or TANF. If you live in Alaska, it's the ATAP program. Prior to the PRWORA, the Clinton welfare reform in the mid 90s, this program was known as Aid to Families with Dependent Children, AFDC. Now, when the original Social Security Act was implemented in 1935, it was simply Aid to Dependent Children, ADC. And in the 50s, the unemployed caretaker was added to the grant, and so that's when it became AFDC. However, there had to be the unemployed caretaker. There couldn't be two spouses in the home. There could only be one spouse, or one adult in the home. So there were a lot of issues with that because of the fact that it required, you couldn't have a man in the home. Long story with that maybe we'll talk about next chapter. I doubt that enough time is going to be devoted to that program to talk about the history of this program, but suffice to say that I know we talked about it a little bit in chapter 2. It's not a pretty picture how it was implemented in those early days, at least. So TANF now is different from AFDC in that there is, for instance, a 5-year limit. We'll get into this more next week. There's a 5-year limit on the amount of benefits an individual can draw in a lifetime, actually, and I think it's 2 years at any one time, I believe it is. Whereas with AFDC, an individual with children age, ranging in age from 1 to 16, could continue on AFDC receiving benefits for their children under 18 until the last child turned 18. Now, in 1965, during the Johnson administration, and these programs really began with the Kennedy's initiatives, I believe, but in the Great Society program, there was enough momentum to get it passed so that the federal health insurance programs, Medicare and Medicaid, were implemented in 1965 with the amendments to the Social Security Act. So it is a part of the Social Security Act, but it's something that, the original Social Security Act had no national health insurance. As I told you before, there was a movement to have national health insurance included, but there were several forces that argued against that, and it was taken out of the Social Security Act before it was passed. And so now, for the first time, we have a federalized medical insurance program, but it's Medicare restricted to federal health insurance to the aged. There are a few other very limited populations that can receive Medicare benefits, and Medicaid was implemented in this federal and state partnership health insurance program for the poor, for those individuals who are poor. So individuals who, for instance, are eligible for TANF are generally also eligible for Medicaid. Some persons who don't receive those benefits may still be eligible for Medicaid, but I think the income requirements are roughly the same. Same thing for SSI. SSI beneficiaries are usually eligible for Medicaid as well. The states administer eligibility for Medicaid, unlike Medicare, which is a federal program and is federally administered. But much of the funding for Medicaid comes from the federal government. Medicare Part D. Now there are two parts to Medicare. I'll just talk about this briefly because we don't really have separate. We don't have much. The text doesn't give much attention to Medicare. But there is a Part A, which is the hospitalization program, and everybody who is 65 gets that and gets it for free. Part B is the outpatient care, outpatient insurance, basically, and everybody over 65 is unless you're self-insured. I don't think. I think everybody is required to have Part B as well if you're eligible for Medicare. And now you're not. This is not needs-based Medicare. It's if you're over 65, you get Medicare. But Part B, unlike Part A, you have to pay a premium every month for your doctor's insurance, the outpatient insurance, Part B, and the premium you pay depends to a certain extent on how much earnings you have otherwise. So if you are retired and say you have you're getting Social Security and you also have one or two different pensions or you have investment funds or whatever, that your income is above a certain level, you'll pay a higher monthly fee for your Medicare Part B than you would than if you had a lower income. Part D is voluntary and covers prescription drugs, and the cost of that is very dependent upon, I think, the program you have. And there are many alternatives out there now where private insurance companies market prescription drug coverages as an alternative to, I think, the Medicare Part D. But that's a whole other discussion. So Medicare is a little complicated. The funding sources are different depending upon which part we're talking about. We'll see that in a second. Medicaid again is needs based, so for the most part you have to have income below a certain level in order to qualify for Medicaid. And because it's a state controlled thing, Medicaid is very political. More on that later. So again, our social insurance programs funded through payroll taxes, and they're placed. Those tax monies are placed in several different trust funds that are administered by a board of trustees appointed by the federal government. Now, it's interesting because I have some conservative friends who are engaged in the business world who insist that there is no protected funds for Social Security, and I suspect there is some truth to that. In that, I understand. I've been told over the years that the federal government has more or less raided the reserves in order to pay for other programs. I can't tell you that that's true. I've heard it often enough that I think it may be, but I don't know when or for what purpose. But there is a trust fund, and it is supposed to be inviolate. Apparently, it isn't. For those of you who were around and paying attention, during the 2000 presidential election, during the debates between Al Gore and George Bush, one of the kind of the running jokes from that debate was Al Gore talking about the lockbox that we would put Social Security monies in, and it would be protected because no one would ever be able to get into it except for Social Security benefits, and that lockbox was one of his things, and it tells me that there have been issues about those monies being used for other purposes, and of course, if they're drawn out of the trust fund, then they're hurting the interest and all of that, but. There is a fund set aside, and this partial reserve system began in 1983 with some of the revisions to the Social Security Act, and inflow exceeds outflow. Okay, so that at least it was for a period of time pretty substantially, and that surplus income was invested in bonds and treasury securities, some of the safest investments in the world. In 2013, trust funds earned $103 billion in interest alone. But there's some concern about long-term solvency of the Social Security system. And part of the reason for this, or really probably most of the reason for this, has to do with the change in the dependency ratio with the my generation, the baby boomer generation, retiring and having fewer workers to support them through their contributions. Touching on that in a moment, but the Social Security program has been very important in that it's, the aggregate poverty rate for the elderly has dropped to something around 9% to 14%, depends upon which poverty index you use. And if you're a white male, of course, you're doing a lot better in that poverty rate than if you're a female or if you're of a minority. But without Social Security, it's estimated the poverty rate would be more than 50% higher for this age group. Critics of this of the system said that, basically it socializes too much of our national income, and it discourages people from saving. A lot of individuals get the sense they don't have to worry about retirement because they'll have Social Security when they retire, so they don't save money. That nobody's going to get rich on Social Security, let me tell you. But it's a very popular program with the elderly, and the American Association of Retired Persons, AARP, is a very powerful lobby, maybe as powerful as the NRA actually, and AARP watches any efforts to cut Social Security or Medicare and lobbies against it, you can be sure. Another part of the social insurance program is the unemployment insurance. And this is different from the Social Security system in that it's a combined state and federal program. That it's administered by the federal government, or overseen rather, I should say, by the Department of Labor. But each state administers its own program, and it's intended to provide temporary and partial replacement of wages to those who have been unemployed involuntarily. If you quit your job or if you get fired for a good reason, you're not eligible for unemployment insurance. But if you get laid off, if the company downsizes, those kinds of things, or if you let go and you can demonstrate that it wasn't for good reason, you're eligible for unemployment insurance. Now, the benefit to this, aside from the fact that but mind you, now it's intended to be temporary, and I think the maximum benefits is something like half of your income. So nobody's going to lay around on unemployment insurance for long because you can't really make ends meet with it. But there's a benefit to this, just like the Social Security system is, and this is talked about repeatedly in this chapter, that it puts money in the hands of individuals who wouldn't have money otherwise, and that money goes back into the economy. And so, it's a benefit to the general economic system to have these programs, because in this case it provides cash to unemployed to purchase goods and services. So to be eligible, you have to be unemployed, you have to be ready and willing to work, you have to be registered for work with the state employment service office. You have to get in and register for work, and you have to, at least in most states I know, you have to demonstrate that you're actively seeking employment. You have to, I don't know how you do this. I guess it depends from state to state, but you demonstrate that you're submitting job applications and things like this. Again, you just can't sit around and draw unemployment, and that's sort of the image that this program isn't supposed to have a stigma, because it is a part of the social insurance system, and yet it does have a stigma for sure. And the other thing, in order to be eligible for this, is you have to have worked in a covered employment, a particular kind of job, during a base eligibility period that I believe varies from state to state, and to have sufficient earnings during that period of time. As we'll talk about here in a moment or two, temporary and part-time employees are at a disadvantage for this because they don't often have enough earnings. Employers contribute to a trust fund that is activated when the employee is laid off. Now, I remember paying what was called an ESC, Employment Security Commission tax, and it was a very small tax, and the text says it's only on the first $7,000, and so it's 0.0 something percent of your income. It's a small tax. It amounts to, I don't know, 50, 60 some dollars, I think. And then after that, no one's taxed for it. So in that sense, it's a regressive tax in that, most everybody earns over 7,000, but for those who are you know, poor, that 7,000 is a bigger portion of their income than it is for those who, earning more money. But it's the same tax for everybody. Also, when you get unemployment benefits, that is federally taxable, and so again, you're getting benefits drawn from this program, and yet you pay taxes on it when it comes time to file for income tax. The maximum caps for benefits in the federal standard is 26 weeks, a half a year, but it's up to the state to set their own timelines, and many states have timelines that limit benefits to as little as 12 weeks. But if there is an economic recession in a particular area and unemployment in the state rises above a certain level, I don't know what that level is, the extended benefits program is activated, and federal dollars come in that allow the unemployed individual get an additional several weeks of benefits. But at the time the text was published, and I think it's true right now also, there are no states that have an unemployment rate high enough to qualify for that. Our unemployment rate has been very, very low in the late 2000 teens. So again, benefits are about half of your wages up to a maximum level based on prior earnings level. There are some states apparently who consider the number of dependents. I wasn't aware of that in determining benefits. There are a number of problems with this program, and here are some of them. We've already touched on some of it. Part-time temporary workers are much less likely to collect benefits, perhaps because their earnings level wasn't sufficient. If they do collect benefits because they earned less and the earnings are based upon a percentage of their earnings during that period, they're not going to get as much money. So part-time temporary workers, low-wage workers, all don't fare as well in this program as those who earn more. Only about half or less of jobless workers receive benefits. Some people just stop looking for work. They just give up. And if you're not looking for work, you don't get benefits. Long-term unemployment becomes a bigger problem with older workers, have a much harder time getting hired. I would say over 50, perhaps 50 years old. Over the years, the amount of benefits have been declining. And as you can see here, the median duration of unemployment between it just in the last decade has was 3 times what it was, less than 10, in the last decade, the beginning of the last decade. Actually, 2007 kind of marks the year when the Great Recession began. So you can kind of see how that was, and one of the things this suggests is the long-term impact of that Great Recession. Even if it looks like stock market's doing great and the banks are back up on their feet and everything, the economy is still suffering, as you can see from some of these statistics. Women, of course, as is often the case, they had less growth in employment opportunities since the recession. Are about 2/3 of the part-time labor force. They're more likely to be the individuals employed by temp agencies, and they have lower wages, and so that makes them less likely. All of those things really combine to make them less likely to meet the eligibility requirements for unemployment insurance. Some women leave their jobs because they're escaping a domestic violence situation, or they have to care for a sick child, and they don't have family medical leave covering them because of the nature of their employment, or their spouse, gets a job somewhere else and they follow that spouse to their new job. Um, Many states offer no consideration for any such situations. Women are the ones who really are the ones who have to pay for those kinds of situations. The lowest paid pay the same fee as the higher paid and are less likely to draw benefits, so it makes the system very regressive in nature. Workers' compensation. Again, Jurgis would have been much better off in the jungle if there was workers' comp out there. First of all, it would have been called workman's comp. It was workman's comp until the last 30 years or so, and somebody got wise and changed it to workers' comp. But the first workers' comp program began in 1911 in Wisconsin and New Jersey. And by 1948, which was after the end of the Second World War, every state had some form of workers' compensation program. 97% of those workers covered by unemployment insurance are eligible for workers' comp. This provides benefits for individuals who are injured or have some sort of occupational illness, something related to the job, and in some cases for their dependents. And it'll provide cash compensation up to about, I think this says about 2/3 of the weekly earnings. That isn't guaranteed, but that's that's uh, the general intent of this program. It will pay for doctors, medical assistance and those kinds of things, doctors' visits, that type of thing, rehabilitation services, disability and death benefits. If it's a occupation, job-related injury or event. Um, As employers assume responsibility for the cost of occupational disabilities without regard to fault, according to the text. But you see here that there are a lot of people that are like business owners and independent contractors who aren't covered by workers' comp, as well as volunteers, farmers, those in the maritime, railroad, and domestic industries. Um, Many employers purchase insurance coverage from private insurance companies, and those private insurance companies, depending upon which company it is, in particular, oftentimes are diligent in trying to disqualify individuals for longer term benefits. I've had a few employees who had a job related injury, falling on a home visit. One place worker walked into kind of a ramshackle home for a home visit, and her foot went through the floor of the Arctic entry, and it injured her foot and it hurt her ankle and everything. She couldn't walk on it for a while, and they, I mean, I just remember a lot of difficulty, that they didn't accept her doctor's assessment. She had to drive to Anchorage and take time off to go up and get it reassessed. And it was, sometimes the insurance companies can be very tough on people who are claiming workers' comp benefits. And I think part of it is because the costs for this program are very, very significant, and a lot of times these companies, as it says here, the companies will encourage people to just take a settlement and get on with things when really they probably do a lot more money than that. Um, I have less confidence in the workers' comp program than any of these programs, based upon my experiences um, in the labor market over the years. A word here, though, where it says something about independent contractors, and this is something you will run into in the field. Um, my son is working for a private for-profit agency, and is, very pleased with the hourly rate he's getting, and plus he has potential to increase it with further education and those kinds of things, as compared to the rate he was getting working for an agency doing somewhat similar work. I haven't asked him this, but my guess is um, they don't offer him health insurance, and they don't offer him workers' comp coverage and all of that. And because I bet you he's an independent contractor. And when you sign with an agency as an independent contractor, you're really waiving a lot of benefits that employees you would have as an employee. Now you're going to make more money because of that. But you have to understand, as it's sort of like we were talking about with private practice, you got to pay your own, retirement fund being set up there. You have you may not have, you probably don't have any health insurance. You may not have workers' comp coverage, because you're not an employee. You're an independent contractor. So many organizations, and I hate to say this, but it's true in social services as well, this field, that we're supposed to care about others. And some of the agencies that are hiring professionals, employees, aren't quite as caring as you might expect them to be. So when you're looking at positions in agencies, and particularly as an independent contractor, find out about benefits and find out about what kind of insurance coverage. You may not even be covered for unemployment insurance. See, this is the thing. With a contract, when you're hired as an employee, there is the expectation if you do your job, you're going to continue to be hired. And, um, um, generally speaking, employers have to. Now, Alaska is a right to or is a right to work state, which the employers have certain leeway in letting you go. I think in this state, but generally speaking, when you're hired as an employee, employers have a commitment to keep you on a job, and they can't just terminate you. Well, if they terminate you without just cause, then they have to pay unemployment insurance. If they hire you on a contract, though, they can simply say, well, we're not going to renew your contract. And there is no unemployment insurance to worry about, that kind of thing. So all I'm telling you is that while the benefits, the independence of being an independent contractor may be wonderful in some respects, on the other hand, just be sure you know what you're getting into, because you may not have the kind of protections that employees would have. There's an aside for you. So there's a lot of questions about Social Security, and is it going to be around, particularly for you younger workers later on? And this is one of these things that I think the text does. Sounds like they really kind of expect Social Security is always going to be there because, well, it's become sort of institutionalized in our nation, and it's unlikely that the public is going to allow the Social Security program to go bankrupt, or to allow their representatives to not take care of it. But it's become the focus of some these entitlement programs, has become the focus because they're very expensive. When you look at the national budget and everything like this, and especially our conservative politicians who are always after the public assistance programs, also have begun to look some at the social insurance programs. And the text says, well, they were successful with welfare reform in the 90s, so now they're turning their attention to Medicare and Social Security. And there are some things that have put a lot of pressures on this system. Now, again, this is a system where workers pay in, and when they retire, then they draw out. And, a lot of things have changed since that system was implemented. For one thing, the dependency ratio, which is, the number of people contributing into the system, paying taxes, versus the number of people drawing from the system, has changed significantly. And the textbook boils this down to workers versus non-workers. Well, it is non-workers, but workers versus the elderly and disabled. And that's not entirely true. Children are also among the non-workers, so it isn't just the elderly and the disabled who are burdening. There are also a lot of children who are a part of the drawing from portion of that ratio. But the dependency ratio anyway has changed significantly, and I forget what it was. It says in the text as to what it was at the time the act was implemented, but it's projected to be as low as 2 to 1, in the very near future. So that because more and more of the baby boomer generation is retiring now. Life expectancy has increased. You see here from 63 at the time that the Social Security Act was implemented to 78 now. So there's an additional 15 years on average that the American adult is living. So you think about that in terms of the retirement age. It's when the retirement age was set at 65, the average life expectancy was only 63 at the time, and so I think they figured, this system's going to pay for itself forever. Well, of course, the life expectancy is only going to continue to increase as medical science continues to have its advancements. Something that perhaps can be done about is the fertility rate has dropped below 2.1. That's the sort of the replacement rate to keep the population stable. The text says it's 1.86. It's probably a little different than that in the present day, but the point is that we're not making as many babies. Now, immigration would have an impact on this. A higher rate of immigration would actually bring more workers into the system, more people paying into the Social Security system. That's something that, the wave of revulsion about immigration that's been going on People are always talking about how they're drawing away benefits from us and everything. They pay into our systems and help to fund our systems, and this is one area where immigration would be beneficial. But life expectancy is longer, fertility rates drop, dependency ratio changing. So that means fewer people are going to support a larger amount of people until such time as the baby boomer generation begins to die off and that balances out more. But if the fertility rate continues to drop, that may be an ongoing issue. Maybe not as great as it is at present time. With a lot of the revisions, it's really gone beyond this taking care of workers, and it's become a bit of a, income redistribution program in many respects. And as this says, there are many workers today that aren't actually going to recover their entire investment. And again, I think we're fooling ourselves if we think of this as an investment. It's a tax. We're paying taxes, and so regardless of how much you are taxed as a worker, I mean, you're not going to get that money back anyway. I don't think I am getting all my Social Security taxes back, and after a full year, or a full career, I should say, well, from the 20 years even based upon that, but. It's a tax. It's not. We shouldn't think of it as an investment, and that's where a lot of people see this. Is I'm not going to get my money back. You're taking care of retirees and disabled persons and their dependents today with this tax, and this system provides several essential functions. First of all, it supports millions of survivors of deceased and disabled workers, as I just suggested. It is described as the most successful anti-poverty program ever in the United States. It provides for many aged beneficiaries at least half of the total income in the household, if not more than that. And this is good for our economy. Elderly persons who would otherwise have less or no income do have income and purchase goods and services. That money goes back into the system. It's good that money is being given to seniors. The other thing is and I forget how it is that the how the textbook refers to this. It's just kind of an interesting kind of way they said it. It says, oh yeah. Few children would trade the burden of payroll taxes for the onus of supporting destitute retired parents. Boy, if that isn't a loving statement, that it reflects something about how we view the elderly in our society. Caring for the elderly in many societies is considered an honor and a privilege. They're revered, but here they're a burden. That's the truth in America, and this relieves many working age adults of the need to provide support for their aging parents. In the past, Congress has addressed some of the solvency issues. In 1983 and in the mid 90s, there have been some amendments to the Social Security Act to help with that. Among other things, a delayed implementation of the cost of living increases for a time. It also changed one big change was is that if an individual has over 25,000 or a couple has income over 32,000 in a year, then portion of their Social Security benefits are taxed. And the full retirement age has been raised from 65. Well, by the time in 67 it will be, I'm sorry, in 2027 it will be 67. This has been gradually increasing based upon when you were born, ever since those who were born in 1943. I think for me, the full retirement was actually 66.0 years. Um, People born a year or two after me was 66 years in 1 month or 2 months and that kind of thing. So eventually its full retirement is going to be 67. Now you're able to take partial retirement at 62, just as an aside here. Not wait for full retirement, but your monthly benefit is reduced, I think 70% to 70% of what would be the full retirement benefits. And if you wait until later, you get a much larger benefit per month. However, you know, people who do these studies, these actual actuarial studies. It's one of those hard words for me. I've read some that said that you're smarter to take an early retirement because you're going to live longer, and in the end you'll draw more benefits. Others I've read said no, no, you should wait for full retirement and that kind of thing. I guess it depends on who you talk to, but anyway, early retirement is possible, but with reduced monthly benefits. Long-term financial prospects depend upon a lot of factors here. How strong the economy is, what are our employment rates going to be? If we have people working and contributing to the system, then that's going to help the Social Security system because there'll be that those contributions will continue. Immigration rate, as I talked about, life expectancy is only going to continue to get longer, I'm sure. I hope at least. And birth rate, perhaps maybe we should just start having more babies. I don't know. But big burden there falls on women. I know, so I'm not pushing that. There are those who say that all these gloom and doom things about the Social Security's future is based upon unrealistic doomsday expectations and tell us not to worry about it. And frankly, I prefer to believe that, but I don't know. I look at the figures that the text talks about, and I've got a couple tables to show you in a minute here. It's questionable, that some believe that it's on sound economic footing, but it is clear that the rate of increase in the reserve has been following steadily, and there are some predictions that the trust fund reserves will be depleted by the mid 2030s, and at that time there would be sufficient money to pay about 75% of the benefits that should be paid. Now, there are some things to do about that. We'll get to that in a minute. By the way, the textbook talks about see, even though this is an updated textbook, there are portions of this textbook that haven't been updated. It said that the disability insurance trust fund would could possibly be exhausted by 2016. Well, hello, that was some years ago, and nobody caught that and updated it. But one of the things that I understand happened is that funds were transferred from the SSA portion of the trust to the disability portion of the trust to give it more years of solvency. So if you go to, there's a little reference to the website down below I looked at. This is the Social Security Trustees website, I believe, on the socialsecurity.gov website. And the trustees report says lawmakers have many policy options that would reduce or eliminate the long-term financing shortfalls in Social Security and Medicare. Lawmakers should address these financial challenges as soon as possible. Taking action sooner rather than later will permit consideration of a broader range of solutions and provide more time to phase in changes so that the public has adequate time to prepare. It's up to Congress, and with the way Congress is these days, I think we need to put pressure on our representatives to get busy on these things and to stop worrying about all these partisan issues that are going on at this day and age. So here's one table from that website that shows the trust fund operations in 2017, and you can see that the reserves for all four of these programs was greater at the end of the year than, with the exception of the Medicare. This is Part B SMI. I forget what that stands for, but the Part B portion had a lower amount of reserves. But otherwise, the reserves grew. But the point of the authors or the doomsdayers saying is that the growth in the trust fund is slowing down remarkably, and that eventually it's going to stop growing. Here's a couple of tables from the same website comparing the costs versus the income. Medicare HI is the hospitalization insurance. That's Part A. The SMI is Part B. Part A, if you look down at the program income, you see that when you look at general revenues, that as far as income goes, the only of these programs that draws from the general revenue fund is Medicare Part B. Otherwise, the funds come from payroll taxes and taxes on Social Security benefits and the earnings interests of the trusts themselves. The focus upon Medicare and how much is taken out of the budget, at least if I'm understanding this correctly, really has more to do with Medicare Part B, doctors' outpatient insurance. But anyway, here you see figures that tell you a little bit about, well, how much money's coming in, where it's being spent, and where it's coming from, and where it's going. So the author says there's nothing inviolate about the way Social Security is currently funded. That means we can change things. An act of Congress could easily eliminate the self-financing social insurance feature of Social Security and replace it with general tax revenues. Given the widespread dependence on Social Security, it seems highly unlikely that policymakers and the public will allow the system to go bankrupt. And I agree with that. Now we think about this with some of the discussions in the last few, well, the last presidential election cycle, and it appears going to be a discussion again, as the next few cycles come about, which is Medicare for all is one of those things that's talked about. Everybody worries about how much taxes are going to go up. Think about how much you're paying out with your premiums now for, and how much you pay for your insurance, your hospitalization insurance, and those kinds of things now. And you wouldn't have those payments anymore. It really, everybody's kind of short-sighted. And again, so this whole thing about being taxed that troubles people. It's something the government takes money from you, and the government decides how it's spent. I don't know. Would you rather hand over your money to a private insurance company who has the same control over your money, and essentially you're stuck paying those. If you think you're going to ever be in the hospital, you're stuck paying that same amount of money, but you're doing it to private insurance companies instead of the government. I don't know why it's worse, but in any event, when we think about this, think about that in terms of how this whole picture might change too with Medicare for all. Now that won't fix the Social Security issue, but in the process of looking at this, in the process of perhaps considering some socialization of the health insurance industry, perhaps our leaders or our policymakers, and that could be someday, could begin to think about bringing retirement into this bigger picture as well, and how Social Security is funded. Here are just a few ideas based upon how the Social Security system is set up today to improve its viability, which is increase the full retirement age to 68. We're living longer, we're healthier longer. 60 is the new 40 now, they say, that kind of thing. So raise the full retirement age again. And one suggestion is to index the longevity so that the age for retirement would correlate with the average life expectancy of males and females, so that, as our life expectancy increases, then the full retirement age would also increase. Recalculate the COLA by using other price indices that might also, be of some benefit. Increase or eliminate the payroll tax cap. And to me, this is something that rescues the wealthy from having to pay a tax. Currently, if you earn more than $118,500, you don't have to pay your Social Security tax anymore. And think about how much money might be generated. So the text says, well, this could result in massive monthly payments for those high salaried employees, those highly paid employees when they retire. Well, you put a cap on the amount you get every month. They're not going to recover their money, but this is a tax. It's not an investment. And these are simple solutions. I mean, simple in terms of thinking it through. Maybe not so simple for people who are the financial wizards and things like that. But there are going to be more creative ideas out there. Privatization is also discussed, and I just kind of listed this as one of those possible solutions. And the Bush administration proposed partial privatization. I think 60% of the Social Security money would be turned back to the worker mandatorily to invest it in a 401k or whatever, some sort of system where, just sort of like private pensions are now, these defined contribution programs where you invest your money and you decide what fund it's put in, and you can watch your money grow or not. Well, you better be a good financial you know, either have a good financial advisor or be wise to the ways of the world and a financial world. And I don't, for myself, that's not me, and I'm not in favor of this. But a lot of people like to have their money to do that themselves, you know. And everything was well. Bush actually was proposing this. This was started in the Clinton administration's idea of privatizing part of the Social Security um, deductions, you know, so that you invested in them as you wanted. Of course, that just relieves the federal government of of responsibility. It isn't necessarily to our benefit, you know, and that's why they're proposing this. But Bush was, I think this was part of his George W. Bush's campaign when he ran and was elected in 2000. When he was appointed by the Supreme Court, I should say, in 2000. Um, he wanted, he was coming in talking about, you know, privatizing part of Social Security, as I recall. But that was one of his big domestic agendas. But then, you know, the September 11th happened just 9 months into his administration, you know, and that kind of diverted his attention altogether. And so by his second term, he had a more specific proposal out there, and it met with a lot of resistance. And then when the financial crash of the stock markets came in 2007, 2008, that was sort of the end of that discussion because people realized that, you know, if we'd had a private system, a lot of those people would have lost their retirement funds. And a lot of people who had retirement funds, you know, of their own and pensions and everything, lost a lot of money then. So Social Security is sort of that buffer against that. You know, at least you know you've got that much. So anyway, that's another alternative. There are things that can be done about Social Security, and so particularly for you younger people who look to the future, or when you're talking to people, younger people about this, you know, and they say, "Oh, there isn't going to be any Social Security by the time I retire." It'll be different, probably. Maybe not, but probably it will be. But there will be something there because this has become a part of the institution of America. Just like as we I think we mentioned a week or two ago, the Affordable Care Act is making healthcare part of healthcare, you know, accessibility. A part of the institution of America that's coming around slowly, but it's coming around. And you know, this whole discussion of Medicare for all, as they call it, wouldn't have even been on the table, you know, a couple elections ago, but now it is. And although a lot of people are saying it's unrealistic, and maybe some of the forms that it's being discussed is at the present unrealistic, but that's the direction we're going, I think, in this society. And it's because the Affordable Care Act, for all its faults, help people recognize that there are certain things as human beings we have a right to, and healthcare is one of those things. Likewise, Social Security, you know, a retirement. Um, we're a wealthy nation, and as a nation, we have a right to be able to, particularly for those of us that work our lives and, you know, live by all those great American values, you know, and those kinds of things. We have a right to have financial security to a certain extent, at least, when we get older. And so this this system is, you know, is the thing we have right now, and we've come to count on it and its availability. I don't see it going away. So we just have to get our legislators working on it seriously, and provide input to your representatives and your senators about what you want to see happen. Let them know what you're thinking. Okay, that's all. That's the end of this chapter. I babbled on long enough. Hope there was something helpful for you here. Let me know if there's any questions come up.